I'm Sam Heyman. I'm doing farming and rural communities, mostly focused in northeastern Utah around Logan. These guys tend to be presented in the media as low educated, low income, right leaning. Um, these are all generally true. However, the education that people in these communities have is more tied to their lifestyle and to the farming, and there's less necessity to get an education from universities and things where that you would see in an urban community. The low income is more tied to the economic swings of the agriculture in the area. Right leaning is accurate. However, that's more when in presidential and national elections. When it comes to local elections, they tend to be more diverse in their voting habits. One thing that is missed by the media is the migratory farm aspect seems to be left out. And 75% of the workers in the agricultural community in the United States are actually foreign born, which is typically not brought up in the media. This is mostly a product of the strong migrant farm workers that we have in the United States. There's a strong family structure within a rural community. This is due to the multi-generational families that all tend to work together for the farm work. The multi-generational families can be spread throughout the community or are all within one region. And that is a help to those communities because they all tend to aggregate together and help each other out. However, it also brings a lot of the older geriatric populations away from the healthcare centers. And so it makes geriatric populations more difficult to treat and get routine screenings because they're further away from the healthcare centers that they might need to go to. The peer involvement is relatively strong. The community tends to support one another, and therefore you have a high reliance on each other and assistance from one another within the community. The danger is when one of those folks is exiled, and this exile can lead to more problematic outcomes like substance abuse. There's a diminished reliance on social media, which has a positive and a negative aspect to that. But when healthcare is trying to promote messages or trying to get help and assistance out to these communities, it's more difficult without social media aspects. So they have to rely on word of mouth and community centers and organizations in order to distribute information. The nice thing about the low population density, however, is that communicable diseases have a more difficult time moving around. And so because of that, you have fewer communicable diseases within these areas. However, when those areas do receive those diseases, they tend to move quickly because the vaccination rates and routine health screenings are more limited than urban areas. This was seen pretty robustly with the more recent COVID-19 outbreaks. As far as cyclical natures of the area, there is the dependence on substance abuse, and that does have a cyclical nature. However, it's less like those in urban centers because this is more tied to single individuals than it is to a generational cyclical nature of substance abuse. What you more likely will see is that the independent nature of the urban lifestyle tends to create a sense of pride, which makes them less likely to seek out help and health care that you would see in an urban setting. And that has larger consequences for how well they can overcome things like cancers and other more routine health issues. When it comes to the legal and political system, a lot of the attention is going to go to a large population center. This is obvious when it is something like Salt Lake, where you have a lot of small farming communities around this Salt Lake urban center. And Salt Lake will receive a lot of the political money, and they generate a lot of the political willpower and push a lot of the legislation out. So the sway of the urban centers is much stronger than it is in the rural centers. However, this leads to a much larger participation in local elections because many of the community members know each other and know the people that are running for those elections. The other thing that has a negative impact on the political system within these rural communities is the long distances between where they live and where they need to vote. And so that has a negative impact on voter turnout. That independence that was referenced earlier is probably the biggest hindrance to potential barriers towards healthcare. The independence makes them more reluctant to get routine screenings and to seek healthcare for smaller health-related issues that may develop into larger problems down the road. The reluctance in screenings leads to an increase in certain types of cancers, and then the independence has also led to less education with regards to things like substance abuse, and therefore when those issues take hold in the communities, it's more difficult to treat. The conservative leaning makes alternative lifestyles less accepted generally, and so there's a barrier towards health for people that have alternative lifestyles to get healthcare related to that's more specific to their lifestyle. That last bullet should say reluctance to move there as healthcare workers. And what that means is that doctors and other healthcare workers are less likely to move to rural settings because there's less money in it. And it has less of a draw for those healthcare workers. And so therefore there's a big divide between high quality healthcare and an agricultural, farming, and rural community. Anytime that you have more isolated communities, there seems to be an increase in violence. That's both like person to person as well as intimate violence. And so on an international scope, you see that trend proliferated when you look at farming communities worldwide. A big problem as well is the lack of resources. This includes food as well as clean water, and both of those contribute to health-related problems. Cholera is a great example of that. And then nutritional deficiencies that might occur within a low resource region. And typically on an international scope, farming communities have limited access to healthcare and monetary resources, which they might have in an urban setting. As far as a socioeconomic status, like we were talking about before, there's limited resources, but the resources that are limited are also more difficult because it's hard to disperse those to the members because the distance between homes and community members is larger, so getting the healthcare to each of them is challenging. There's a lower rate of advanced education, and why that's important is because there's fewer doctors that come into that community, and that community also produces fewer healthcare workers. This makes healthcare less accessible, and that's exacerbated on the fact that the high-quality healthcare is further away from the neighborhoods which would need it anyways. On top of that, you have a lot of environmental hazards. Unintentional injuries are 50% higher in these communities, and that's usually related to workplace injuries. And so you have an area where there's a lot of environmental hazards, a reluctance to seek out resources, a difficulty of getting the resources to those folks, and then that distance element, and it makes it more difficult for healthcare to be received in the same rate that they would be in urban settings. The lack of economic stability, which leads to the socioeconomic status of these communities, is mostly tied to the fluctuations of agricultural commodities and what the prices are at the time. As far as race and ethnicity go within the the rural settings, it has a lot to do with those migrant farm workers we were talking about before. Migrant farm workers may not be documented, therefore there's a fear of exposure, fear of seeking out help. There is a fair amount of discrimination, and so therefore this population may be very reluctant to seek out healthcare, receive healthcare, and expose themselves when necessary. As mentioned before, rural residents tend to be a more religious sector. In Utah, we see a lot of Mormon, Catholic, evangelical communities. And those types of religious decisions influence the health decisions. Some cultures have rules that disallow certain types of healthcare or discourage certain types of healthcare, and therefore you see that influence the overall healthcare of that community. However, in Utah, with the predominant religion being Mormonism, much of their healthcare related decisions actually improve the overall health, and you have fewer detrimental decisions. As far as gender roles go, there's a stronger diversity as tied to division of labor. Women tend to be more likely to raise the children, and that removes them from certain elements of the lifestyle. There's a more limited acceptance for LGBTQ communities, or members within the community. And so you see that creates healthcare related concerns for those members. This also will impact routine screenings in healthcare. A good example would be HPV screenings and other types of gender-specific screenings that would be routine within an urban setting, but may be more encumbered in these rural settings. The largest concern as far as geographic location goes is just the distance. There's a long commute to get to healthcare facilities, which creates a delay in care, and it also creates that difficulty in attracting quality physicians out to those areas. There's a prediction of about 20,000 primary care physicians by 2025 in these communities nationwide, and so we're starting to see that aggregate even in Utah. As far as bias, there's a lack of care towards healthcare improvement. So you see that being a lower priority to get quality healthcare into the communities. Poverty being entrenched in the culture, that's definitely not true. It's not entrenched. Like we said earlier, it follows economic swings. It follows the deviations of the agricultural crop. And rural residents are white only. Like we said earlier, 20% of all agricultural people all agricultural workers are people of color. And so there's much more diversity within this sector than thought. On an international scope, the division of labor is stronger in third world countries, and so you tend to see more women actually in the fields than men. Poverty tends to be stronger. Rural citizens represent a greater proportion worldwide, and so therefore there's more of this division between the urban and the rural. Rural healthcare is more challenged in the disadvantaged countries because it's difficult to get those resources out to them. And then, like I was saying earlier, the women are a more representative sector of the agriculture in general. There's all them resources and references that were utilized